It's a profound fact of human nature. Human beings are curious creatures. So present us with a good mystery, and even with all the technological advances of the 21st century, we're hooked. Codes, symbols, and secret societies will have us all intrigued, as proved by the recent publishing phenomenon, the Da Vinci Code, which aroused the detective in each and every one of us. And of course, in true Dan Brown style, this leads us very neatly to the subject in question, Freemasonry. Just in case you've been on another planet for the last couple of years, Dan Brown is the author of the Da Vinci Code, and a number of the clues in this page-turner of a novel and major Hollywood movie lead us to the Knights Templar, an elusive society from history often associated with the Freemasons. Now, fascinating as all this is, and as much as it equips you to answer obscure crossword clues, it probably doesn't tell you any more about Freemasonry than you already knew. But that's nothing out of the ordinary when it comes to the subject of Freemasonry. We are fascinated by this society because of its secrecy. And when the subject crops up in conversation between a random group of people, you can guarantee that the only person not to offer an opinion is likely to be a Freemason. Throughout history, Freemasons have kept their silence, even when those all around have accused them of the most bizarre ritual activities. And of course, because of this refusal to even comment on what is in effect utter nonsense most of the time, the record for the wider world has never been put straight. However, as we set out on this fascinating journey of discovery, it's only right and proper to point out that this program is not an expose of all things Masonic. It's far more interesting than that. This is an amateur detective's delight as we step back in time to piece together the clues that will answer many of the questions a good inquiring mind would ask about Freemasonry. And we can promise that the paths we'll follow and the destinations we'll reach will prove to be both enlightening and surprising. So, before we begin, here's a brief rundown of how the public at large generally perceives Freemasonry. First, when you hear the word Mason uttered, images of complicated secret handshakes involuntarily spring to mind. Over the centuries, cartoonists and satirical writers have had a very amusing time thinking up possible options about that handshake. But the truth is, only a Freemason could dispute such speculation, and even if you can find one, he never will. Next, most people are aware there is some kind of initiation ceremony which requires the exposure of a bare breast, one leg to the knee, and a blindfold. Now again, you would have to become a Freemason to know for sure. But as you might imagine, the probable rituals that the uninitiated have come up with are about as far from the truth as the myth of the lodge goat. It's a well-known fact that Freemasons belong to lodges where they can meet together, quite literally all over the world. And the myth of a lodge goat being kept for use in initiation rituals has been popular. However, you don't need to be a Freemason to work out that this is one urban legend with no basis in fact whatsoever. Yet the source of the rumor isn't too difficult to track down. Back in the Middle Ages, as we'll explore further later, there were detractors of Freemasonry who accused them of being Satanists, and the goat has long been a symbol of the devil. Matters weren't helped when early Freemasons' documents described their supreme being as God of all things, abbreviated to G-O-A-T, or GOAT, which just goes to show how things get distorted when human curiosity is aroused and brains start working overtime. When you look out for them, there are Masonic symbols to be found all around. Many of us will immediately think of the all-seeing eye over an Egyptian pyramid on the $1 bill. With conspiracy theories and movies to fuel them, all sorts of significance have been read into this, and although fascinating, are in most instances flights of fancy. Throughout history, the all-seeing eye has been a symbol used by many cultures to represent God, in many cases for centuries before the Freemasons came into being. Also, the 13 rows of stones making up the pyramid literally refer to the 13 original colonies of America. But we will, like all good detectives, return to the Great Seal of the United States for a closer inspection a little later in the proceedings. Along with handshakes, initiation rituals, and dollar bills, you might also have heard of Masonic artifacts, such as rings, aprons, and ceremonial regalia. But their meaning and function are mystifying, to say the least. To put it concisely, unless you become a Freemason, you are never going to know for sure about any of this. Nevertheless, as the uninitiated or profane, the accepted term for a non-Mason, we might never discover how it all works, but we can have a great deal of fun finding out why. Meet Tom Franklin, a rare and very talented craftsman who holds the key to the great mystery that is Freemasonry. But, I hear you cry, that's a chisel and hammer he's got in his hands. There's not a key in sight. Well, of course, he could batter down just about any locked door with these tools. Yet as a man of immense skill and precision, he would never need to. What you see before you is a stonemason, who is something of a rarity in a modern world, demonstrating an art form that has been in existence since the dawn of civilization. His predecessors include such luminaries as Michelangelo, and back at the turn of the first millennium, stonemasons were considered incredibly important people all over Europe. In England, the arrival of the Normans with William the Conqueror in 1066 transformed architecture all across the land. Previously, buildings were constructed predominantly of timber, but with French stonemasons being brought to build castles and cathedrals, there were big changes on the horizon. Another factor also gave the stonemason an almost holy status in society. Just as there were worries about the year 2000 and predicted disasters, exactly the same thing happened at the first millennium. When the people realized they had survived, they gave glory to God, building cathedrals and churches everywhere they could. In England alone, some 9,000 parish churches, abbeys, monasteries, and cathedrals were constructed, and the stonemason's art was a source of wonder to his fellow man. Now, the stonemasons were a clever bunch, and they soon realized that keeping what they knew about building to themselves was a very wise move. and consequently by the 1300s, a craftsman's guild for stonemasons had developed. To learn the skills, most training took place in quarries, away from prying eyes, where the stone was almost finished before it was taken to the site. If a young apprentice showed aptitude, he could advance through the various levels by hard work to become a master mason, and then the world was quite literally his oyster. The normal hierarchy of European feudalism simply didn't apply, and a meritocracy prevailed. The actual term Freemason first appeared as the local stone from northern France and the south of England. A very manageable, soft type of limestone was called freestone. The men that worked it were called freestone masons, which over the years became abbreviated to Freemason. However, other theories suggest that as the stonemasons traveled around the country wherever required, they were free rather than bound to the land as the serfs were. Here's an interesting thought. You're a medieval stonemason traveling around Europe, and you turn up to build the next cathedral. It's impossible to carry a portfolio. Stones are far too heavy, and besides, your work is usually attached to great buildings, as typified by these magnificent stone carvings at the front of the beautiful Notre Dame in Paris, France.
Te lucis ante terminum, rerum creator pascimus.
These stunning digital stills of the rose window would have come in very handy. But back in the Dark Ages, the early stonemasons needed some badge of office to say they were capable of such work. After all, they certainly didn't have the time to carve a sample gargoyle or flying buttress to prove their worth when they arrived to start a new commission. Consequently, as they reached certain levels of skill, the stonemasons had signs and passwords known only unto themselves. And of course, it was vital that they were never discovered. Otherwise, anyone could have put themselves forward as a qualified stonemason, which would have soon brought the craft into disrepute. If you travel through England visiting churches, cathedrals, and abbeys, there's another type of building you will often find close by. Many public houses, or pubs as they are better known, were built and supplied with ale by the clergy authorities to house and feed the traveling craftsmen. There are pubs called the Masons' Arms and the Carpenters' Arms all over the country, where each group of artisans would have their own meeting place. If you find a pub called the Masons' Arms, chances are it will be very old. And if you're very lucky, you may find a beer called Bishop's Finger, which has links back to early Freemasonry. Interestingly, the name has nothing to do with clergymen's fingers in the brew. A bishop's finger was actually an ancient signpost unique to Kent, which pointed pilgrims in the direction of Canterbury Cathedral, a fine example of many a good stonemason's art. At this point, particularly if you're sat in an old English hostelry supping real ale, you might well be wondering how such a seemingly sensible craftsman's guild could evolve to cause such controversy. Remembering the intrigue, puzzles, and secret societies of Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, you find yourself asking how these ancient church builders are connected with an order like the Knights Templar, the Illuminati, and even more importantly, the wisest king of the Old Testament, Solomon. Well, yet again, our talented stonemason is the key, as we step back in time to Jerusalem in about 964 BC. Solomon was the third king of Israel, and he built an incredible temple, complete with 3,000 tons of gold and 300,000 tons of silver. The stones were cut from underground quarries below Jerusalem, and the nation's best stonemasons worked for years to complete the task, which also included a citadel and a royal palace. Eventually, the Ark of the Covenant, which held the fragments of the 10 Commandments given to Moses, was installed in the inner sanctum, which was revered as the hallowed dwelling place of God. Today, little remains of Solomon's great temple, only some stone foundations, which are better known to the world in 21st century Jerusalem as the Wailing Wall. King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon burned the temple down in 597 BC after stealing all the artifacts. However, the Ark of the Covenant vanished without trace, and its whereabouts is to this day one of the great mysteries of the ancient world, along with the Holy Grail. Although the temple was rebuilt some 50 years later, by AD 70 the occupying Romans had destroyed that too. The sacred site of the temple, Mount Moriah, is also where the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven after climbing a ladder of light that rose from a stone, which came from Solomon's temple. And this is where our Knights Templar come into the story, because of course Jerusalem is a sacred city for the followers of Islam, as well as the Christians. Mention the Crusades and King Richard the Lionheart, and most of us will imagine brave knights rescuing damsels in distress, and Robin Hood stealing from the rich to give to the poor, while King Richard was away fighting his holy war. However, the Crusades were anything but romantic, as Christians and Muslims fought for control of Jerusalem. And the Poor Knights of Christ were founded to offer pilgrims safe passage from Jaffa to Jerusalem. They were eventually given headquarters among the ruins of the Temple of Solomon, and they became known as the Poor Knights of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, eventually to be abbreviated to the Knights Templar. Also, they didn't stay poor very long, and with newfound wealth became powerful in banking. There was a secret initiation into the order, and when the Knights Templar were persecuted and destroyed in the 14th century, many people believe that they disappeared into the hidden ranks of the Freemasons. It's also been suggested that these knights escaped with the order's treasure, including both the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy Grail, but that's another story altogether. Nevertheless, before we leave Solomon's Temple, there's another legend that anyone interested in the development of Freemasonry definitely needs to take a closer look at. Although we can only imagine what Solomon's Temple would have looked like, we can be pretty certain that he needed a master mason to build it. And sure enough, the Bible tells of just such a craftsman who knew all the top-secret tricks of the trade. Despite there being little information about him as the grand architect of the temple, the legend of Hiram Abiff has evolved over time and is extremely significant to Freemasons the whole world over. One day, as the devoted Hiram was leaving the temple after completing his work, he was stopped by lesser stonemasons who demanded to know the secrets of the master masons. Sworn never to divulge this information, Hiram refused and was attacked by the three men with the tools of their craft, and the final blow killed him. The murderers bury their victim and attempt to escape justice, but are captured and executed. The body of Hiram Abiff is then discovered and pulled from the ground by another master mason to be given a proper burial, with full honors for a man who gave his life rather than betray a sacred trust. So I hear you ask, what has this ancient legend with roots in the Bible got to do with Freemasonry today? Well, it's now time to look at how Freemasonry works and what a prospective candidate wanting to join this secret society might experience. This spectacular building is the home of the United Grand Lodge of England, which was founded in an alehouse long since demolished, called the Goose and Gridiron in 1717. By the time this happened, the Freemasons were either operative, basically working stonemasons, or non-operative, from any other walk of life. The earliest record of a non-operative Freemason dates back to the 1600s in Scotland, and considering how rare 21st century stonemasons tend to be, this proved to be crucial to the society's survival. However, today there is still a list of criteria that anyone wishing to become a Freemason must satisfy, dating back to those early beginnings, including the necessity for candidates to put themselves forward of their own free will. Interestingly, Masons will never invite others to join for this reason. Even when a father would really like his son to follow in his Masonic footsteps, he can never ask, only wait and hope. So what other requirements are demanded of a proposed candidate wishing to join a lodge? Well, you may have noticed throughout this film that all references to Freemasons have been masculine, and this is because mainstream Masonry is a men-only establishment. If you look hard enough throughout history, you will find attempts by the girls to get in on the act with female groups like the Order of the Eastern Star, founded in Boston, Massachusetts, but they are few and far between. Basically, no matter how enlightened the age is that we live in, you still have to be a man to join the Freemasons. As contentious an issue as Freemasonry and gender might be to outsiders in the 21st century, the next criteria is often equally as difficult to grasp. To become a Freemason, you must believe in a supreme being. It doesn't matter what a man's religion is, so long as he acknowledges the existence of a higher order. The classic Masonic symbol of a stonemason's square and compass, complete with the letter G for God, confirms this. But who or what that God might be is never dictated and left totally as a matter of personal choice. Next, to qualify, a man must be free-born, and this is a throwback to the days of slavery. It's been retained out of a sense of heritage, as the question is no longer relevant. A man must also be of lawful age, which traditionally is 21, although there are variations. And lastly, must be recommended by at least 2 existing Freemasons at the lodge he wants to join. Despite Freemasonry often being associated with business and commerce, there are no financial or social requirements. All men are considered equal within the fraternity, quite literally from presidents to pig farmers, so long as they qualify for membership and agree to abide by the rules. Now, this is where Freemasonry gets really interesting, once a petitioner has been accepted to join a lodge. There are 3 ceremonies called degrees, with the first being that of the entered apprentice, which is an initiation that represents youth. Blindfolded, or hoodwinked, as it's been termed in the ancient texts, in special clothing with a rope around his neck, the candidate will take his oath, after which point he will be allowed to see the other Freemasons present as the blindfold and rope are removed. When this initiation ceremony is complete, the new Freemason will be presented with a white leather apron, which is part of the Mason's regalia. This takes us right back to our stonemason, as the apron is based on the ones these master craftsmen use to keep their tools in. A Freemason's apron can be very ornate and will always be spotlessly clean, unlike their historic counterparts. After this initiation, the entered apprentice can progress through the next 2 degrees at his own pace. Depending on the lodge, this can be in days, weeks, months, or years, but the Mason in question must prove his proficiency before moving on. After becoming an entered apprentice, the 2nd degree is that of fellow craft, symbolizing adulthood, and the ceremony is very similar to the first, although the clothing and the rope used will be worn in a different way. Lastly, the 3rd degree of Master Mason is the highest rank achievable. Representing maturity, the ceremony begins in the same style as the previous levels. But in the 2nd part of the proceedings, the story of Hiram Abiph's murder in the Temple of Solomon and his resurrection is represented with the candidate taking on the role of the ancient Master Mason. Because Freemasons are the only people that know for sure precisely what happens, these ritual degree ceremonies do invite both speculation and suspicion. Yet the main purpose, particularly of the Master Mason's degree, is to encourage the man in question to reflect upon life and death, and how he should honorably conduct himself on both counts. Taken at face value, therefore, it would seem that there is little for outsiders of Freemasonry to feel concerned about, as the members are simply bound by brotherly love, mutual assistance, equality, secrecy, and trust. Nevertheless, throughout the society's history, Freemasons as individuals have suffered for their beliefs, and even today face persecution in some countries of the world for belonging to this ancient fraternity. With this in mind, let's turn detective once more and follow the course of Freemasonry from the United Grand Lodge of England in the 18th century to the present day. We'll uncover the myths and find the facts that will help us better understand the role of the Freemason around the world in the 21st century. All this talk of equality and fraternity does begin to ring historical bells, especially as by the mid-1700s, the American colonists were starting to get impatient with restrictive British laws controlling them. Equally, when the first American lodges started to form, the members certainly favored doing things in their own way. By 1730, there were lodges in Philadelphia and Boston, and the Grand Lodge in London set up provincial lodges to cater for the rapid growth in Freemasonry. It's interesting to note that by the time the American Revolution broke out in 1775, many of the movers and shakers were actually Freemasons. However, you shouldn't necessarily believe all you might hear about the role of the Freemasons in the struggle for independence. Today, drinking tea is considered to be a peculiarly English tradition, but it was a great favorite with the American colonists. When the British government put a heavy tax on tea, along with many other commodities, the colonists argued for no taxation without representation, but their demands were ignored. The battle lines were drawn in 1773 when a group of men dressed as Native American Indians boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and tipped the consignment of 300 chests of tea into the water, an event that has gone down in history as the Boston Tea Party. It's been suggested on many occasions that these resourceful protesters were Freemasons from Boston's St. Andrew's Lodge that met at the Green Dragon Tavern. But here's the interesting bit. There was also a revolutionary group called the Sons of Liberty who met at the Green Dragon. And it won't come as any surprise to learn that there were some men who were members of both groups. The most notable was Paul Revere, who even at this early stage in the conflict was set to become one of America's greatest patriots. Paul Revere was a gold and silversmith by trade. However, it was his midnight ride on April the 18th, 1775, to warn the colonists that the British were coming that he is best known for. Yet Paul Revere wasn't the only Freemason involved in the birth of the new American nation, despite the fact that the Boston Tea Party was not a Masonic operation. Benjamin Franklin, John Hancock, Robert Livingston, and George Washington were all Freemasons. And in all, 9 of them signed the Declaration of Independence. In point of fact, of the 56 men regarded as the Founding Fathers, 20 had Masonic links. Even today, reading the words of this most historic of documents, there are echoes of the principles of Freemasonry. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, which include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Furthermore, when George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States after the defeat of the British, the Bible used in the ceremony came from the Masonic Lodge in New York. Freemasons today still use ceremonial Bibles, but in many lodges where members are of different faiths, a Tanakh and a Koran will be used as well. However, on the day of George Washington's inauguration, it was a Bible that was required. Because by the time he'd ridden from his Mount Vernon home to New York for the ceremony in the Federal Hall on Wall Street, nobody had thought to bring a Bible on which he could take the oath of office. Close by was the St. John's Masonic Lodge, and their Bible was duly fetched for George Washington to use. Interestingly, 5 presidents, including Washington, have sworn their oaths of office on this historic St. John's Bible. Warren G. Harding, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Jimmy Carter, and George Herbert Walker Bush, although only Washington and Harding were actually Masons. There would have been a 6th, as George W. Bush requested the St. John's Bible for his inauguration, and it was reverently hand-carried from New York all the way to Washington, D.C. But unfortunately, because of heavy rain on the day, it couldn't be used. Ironically, the Bible then went on to survive the destruction of 9/11, as it was displayed in a museum not 3 blocks away from the World Trade Center at the time of the disaster. Before we leave this incredible era when the United States of America began to develop and grow, as promised, we'll take a closer look at the Great Seal, that all-seeing eye which has been displayed on the dollar bill since 1935 and long considered a Masonic symbol. At the birth of a nation, there are many things a new government needs to consider, and in 1776, a committee of 4 men were chosen to design the Great Seal of the United States. The only Freemason of the group was Benjamin Franklin, and the idea for the eye and the pyramid came from the non-Masons, ruling out any undue influence there. Also, the Latin inscription Novus Ordo Seclorum has been cited as proof of further Masonic messaging because of its mistranslation through the ages as a New World Order. However, a more correct translation would be a New Order of the Ages, which makes these words perfect for the Great Seal with not a hint of anything sinister, Masonic or otherwise. The coming together of Freemasonry with revolution undoubtedly proved to be a positive force in America rather than a negative influence. But in France, it was a very different story. As the French peasants revolted, the Freemasons of that nation were admired, especially with their motto, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, which literally translates as liberty, equality, and brotherhood. In fact, the revolutionaries liked the motto so much, they adopted it as their own. But this ended up being really bad news for the Masons. As the revolution degenerated into murder and mayhem, the Freemasons were wrongly linked to the bloodshed, and the French lodges virtually disappeared, until Napoleon became Emperor of France in 1804, when he actually adopted Protector of Freemasonry as one of his titles. It's been rumored that Napoleon Bonaparte was a Freemason, but there is no historic proof of this. Nevertheless, he was true to his word, and Freemasonry was restored to its previous popularity in France. What happened to Freemasons in France due to misinterpretation was certainly typical of the problems that would be faced by the society worldwide during the 19th century. Even today, if you look up Freemasonry on the internet, you'll find a considerable amount of material that's far from complimentary. But again, we go back to the fact that Masons will remain silent in the face of speculation leveled by those outside the fraternity. In America, after the War of Independence, the Masons moved out of the taverns into purpose-built Masonic halls. And as these wonderful early photographs show, the grand style of building would have even done King Solomon proud. Needless to say, the number of Freemasons increased to include some of society's most respected citizens. However, in 1826, the William Morgan affair turned public opinion dramatically against the Masons. In upstate New York, a disgruntled Mason named William Morgan threatened to reveal the secrets of Freemasonry by publishing a book on the subject. Then he disappeared. Fellow Masons admitted to having abducted him, but only to send him on his way to Canada with a $500 payoff, never to return. But he couldn't be found to confirm this, and suspicion grew that he'd been executed according to Masonic ritual. The Freemasons in question were brought to trial, but not on murder charges, and they were given lenient sentences. Far from being the end of the matter, the general public was outraged, believing the officers of the court to be Freemasons looking after their own, and worse was to come. When William Morgan's book was later published, it became an instant bestseller. Anti-Masonic hysteria spread across the USA, and in 10 years, membership of lodges dropped by more than half. Matters didn't improve until after the end of the Civil War in 1865, when numbers gradually started to recover and the Freemasons re-emerged in America. And so it has continued down through the years, with Freemasonry regularly facing accusations of conspiracy due to its secret nature, ranging from the mildly amusing to the downright ridiculous. To play detective a little more, let's return to London, more specifically Whitechapel, a short distance from the Freemasons' Hall, and step back in time to the year 1888. Terror reigned as a serial killer, dubbed by the press Jack the Ripper, stalked the streets, murdering and mutilating at least 5 prostitutes. The crimes remain unsolved to this day, but the finger of suspicion has consistently been pointed at the Freemasons. Firstly, the nature of the mutilations has raised questions being similar to the ceremonial penalties threatened for betraying Masonic vows. For example, the penalty described in the Masonic ritual for the entered apprentice is having the throat cut from ear to ear, a technique that Jack the Ripper inflicted upon all his victims. But don't get carried away. This needs to be viewed with extreme caution. After all, the victims were women rather than men, and as a modus operandi, throat cutting is about as universal as shooting for those bent on committing murder most foul. Then, of course, there's the question of the graffiti scrawled in chalk on a wall nearby one of the murder scenes. It said, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Now, this particular district in the late 19th century had a large Jewish population, and there had already been violence on the streets due to anti-Semitic feeling. When the mutilated body and the message were discovered, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Charles Warren, ordered the message to be erased immediately, before it could even be photographed, so as not to risk a riot. There is, however, an alternative view shared by the conspiracy theorists. Within Freemasonry, the three attackers of Hiram Abiff in Solomon's Temple are named Jabella, Jubilo, and Jubellum, and those on the trail of something more sinister in Warren's actions suggest that these are the Jews being referred to, and not the people of the Jewish faith. Sir Charles Warren was indeed a Freemason, and it's been proposed that he was covering up a royal conspiracy, no less, which involved a number of preeminent Masons. Even so, nobody could accuse Queen Victoria, Britain's reigning monarch, of being a Freemason, as she was a woman. But we do know that her son, the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, most definitely was. However, this conspiracy theory actually involves his eldest son, Queen Victoria's grandson, known as Prince Eddie. The story goes that Eddie was rather fond of visiting the ladies of ill repute in Whitechapel, and he actually married a prostitute called Annie Crook in a secret ceremony. This was scandalous enough, as Eddie was a future heir to the throne of Great Britain. But to make matters worse, or so the story goes, she was a Catholic, which made the marriage illegal because of the Act of Succession. It's alleged that the only witnesses to this event were, yes, you've guessed it, 5 prostitutes from Whitechapel, namely the victims of Jack the Ripper. The evil assassin hiding behind the black swirling cloak was believed to be none other than Queen Victoria's own personal surgeon, Sir William Gull, the appointed executioner of the Freemasons' plot to protect the good name of the royal family. If this all sounds beyond credulity, you'll find a very good reason why when you delve a little deeper. At the time of the murders, Sir William Gull was 72 years old, and he suffered with a heart condition that meant chasing young women through the dark alleys of London would have been out of the question. So this version of events probably owes a great deal more to fiction than to fact. And here's just one last point that's very telling in this bizarre explanation of the Freemasons' involvement in the Jack the Ripper case. The man behind this particular theory actually died of a brain tumor in 1985, at which point a friend of his, who shared his anti-Masonic point of view, alleged that the Freemasons had used an ultrasound death ray to kill him. Now, we really are into realms that are stranger than fiction, although it would make a great plot for a thriller, and it just goes to show how deep-seated the suspicion of Freemasonry can actually become. There is nevertheless a more serious side to the persecution of the Freemasons, and as the world faced some of its darkest hours when Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1930s Germany, many Masons paid the ultimate price for belonging to this secret society. There were a number of groups of people that suffered at the hands of Adolf Hitler's misguided beliefs, most notably people of the Jewish faith. In his book Mein Kampf, he laid the blame for Germany's economic and social problems on the Jews, and he systematically set about their extermination at the Nazi death camps across Europe. Hitler also targeted gypsies, homosexuals, those of black ethnic origin, people with disabilities, and even the elderly, as millions were murdered in the name of racial purity. As his power soared to terrifying new heights, and his Nazi army storm-trooped its way through Europe, the Freemasons also came under attack. In a pamphlet entitled Annihilation of Freemasonry Through the Revelation of Its Secrets, he connected the Masons with the Jews and urged that both groups be wiped off the face of the earth. Hitler ranted that it is cheating the people to fight the Jew, while allowing his auxiliary troop, Freemasonry, to function. There was no longer just a whispering campaign and suspicion leveled at the Freemasons. They were identified, shot, or sent to concentration camps wherever the Nazis found them. Lodges were destroyed, and anti-Masonic museums were opened to show the so-called evils of the Brotherhood. World War II cost so many lives, but because of the secret nature of Freemasonry, nobody can say for sure the number of Masons killed, but some estimates are as high as 200,000. Yet there was a real threat to Adolf Hitler from an interesting collection of Freemasons: Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, General Douglas MacArthur, General Omar Bradley, and King George VI were all Masons, and each man was tireless in his dedication to the cause of overthrowing Hitler and his evil regime. Although all unique individuals in their own right, from very different walks of life, the common good of mankind was paramount and was echoed within the principles of Freemasonry. This is the real crux of Freemasonry, and as you can see for yourself from the list of dignified wartime Masonic heroes, when the odds are not in your favor, a band of brothers can be very useful indeed. Today, in a climate where even the Freemasons aren't quite so secretive as they once were, it's not so difficult to find other great men from just about every walk of life who were Masons, including the adventurers Davy Crockett and Charles Lindbergh. 14 American presidents to date: Edward Jenner, Joseph Lister, and Alexander Fleming, all from the world of medicine. Mozart, the great classical composer, and writers Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Mark Twain, to mention but a few. Of course, it's possible to find skeletons in the cupboard of any organization as old as the Freemasons, and read all kinds of hidden meaning into symbols and rituals. You can go on and on finding alleged Masonic messages in such wide-ranging places as the Kryptos sculpture at the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, the Great Seal of the United States, and in the all-seeing eye so often associated with the Illuminati. There are also organizations like Yale University's Skull and Bones, which are similar to Freemasonry but not actually connected in any way at all. It's hardly surprising, therefore, that our great modern-day authors are looking at the subject of Freemasonry for inspiration, with plenty of scope for artistic license. Freemasons tracking the code will undoubtedly have posed equally as many questions as it will have answered, but hopefully you'll have had the opportunity to find the facts and form a considered opinion on this elusive organization. From those early craftsmen who built cathedrals that have never been surpassed, to our present-day politicians, statesmen, and leaders, the Freemasons' heritage is worthy of its respected place in society. If nothing else, for those of us who will never become members, Freemasonry will always be a source of curious fascination. And when it comes to finding a really great plot for a novel or a major Hollywood movie, the subject of Freemasonry has a great deal to offer. And of course, however far-fetched the storyline might be, a policy of no comment from the Freemasons themselves will just fuel our imaginations all the more. As that great Freemason and first President of the United States, George Washington himself said, "To encourage literature and the arts is a duty which every good citizen owes to his country, and it looks as if it's a sentiment that even modern-day Freemasonry is continuing to uphold."